Everyone's talking about ego death right now. It's all over the internet. I had an ego death. The mushrooms killed my ego. I dissolved. And I'm going to be honest with you. 90% of what people call ego death is just a really uncomfortable Tuesday. It's not ego death. It's ego bruising. And there's a massive difference.
Welcome back to the Promethean Depths. I'm SOLEN.
And I am ZAEL. And yes, I know that was a provocative opening. I stand by it. Today we're going deep on one of the most talked about and least understood concepts in both philosophy and modern spiritual culture. Ego death. What it actually is, where the idea comes from, why the internet version is almost completely wrong, and Solen's favorite part.
What you actually do with it. Yes? Let's go.
So before we get into the psychedelic Instagram version of ego death, let's go back to where this idea actually lives. Because it's not new. It's not a 1960s counterculture invention. This idea is ancient, and it shows up across traditions in ways that are remarkably consistent. In Hinduism, the concept of ahamkara, the I maker, the part of the mind that constructs the sense of a separate self. Vedic philosophy says this construction is real in a functional sense, but ultimately false in an absolute sense. Liberation, moksha, involves seeing through it. In Buddhism, anatta, non-self, the Buddha's most radical teaching, not that you don't exist, but that the thing you think of as you, the fixed, permanent, separate self, is a fabrication, a story the mind tells itself every morning. In Christian mysticism, the via negativa. Meister Eckhart, a 13th century German mystic, talked about Abgeschiedenheit, detachment, the complete emptying of the self so that something greater could fill it. He was nearly declared a heretic for it.
And in Jungian psychology, which is where I want to spend some time because Jung gives us the most psychologically precise map of this, individuation involves the ego being decentered, not destroyed, decentered. The ego moves from being the master of the psyche to being a servant of something larger, the self with a capital S.
And that distinction, decentered versus destroyed, is everything. Because the Instagram version of ego death is about obliteration, about becoming nothing, about transcending the self entirely. And I'm sorry, that's not liberation, that's dissociation, that's a trauma response with better branding.
That's a strong claim.
It's an accurate one. Jung was very clear about this. He called it inflation. When someone has a genuine experience of the deeper layers of the psyche, whether through meditation, crisis, or yes, psychedelics, the ego can respond in two ways. It can integrate the experience, which is painful and slow and requires real work, or it can be overwhelmed by it and identify with it. I am no longer an ego. I am one with everything. And that person becomes insufferable and usually falls apart within 2 years.
The technical term for that is psychic inflation. The ego doesn't disappear. It expands to fill the entire psyche. Paradoxically, the person becomes more ego-driven while believing they've transcended ego entirely.
Every spiritual community has at least 3 of these people.
At minimum.
So here's what I actually think is happening culturally right now. We are living through a period of collective ego crisis. And I mean that in the clinical sense, not the dismissive sense. The structures that used to give people a stable sense of identity, religion, nationality, career, family roles, they're all destabilizing simultaneously. People don't know who they are anymore in the way previous generations did. And into that vacuum comes this idea of ego death as a solution. I'll just dissolve the problem. I'll get rid of the self that's suffering.
And I think that's genuinely worth compassion, because the suffering underneath it is real. The disorientation is real. I just think the solution being offered is incomplete at best.
At best.
What the Stoics would say, and this is Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, all of them, is that the self is not the problem. The undisciplined, unexamined, reactive self is the problem. The solution isn't to destroy the self. The solution is to build a self that's actually worth inhabiting.
Epictetus was a slave, literally owned by another human being. And he didn't dissolve his ego. He built an interior life so solid that his owner's cruelty couldn't reach it. That's not ego death, that's ego mastery. Completely different project.
And there's a reason that distinction matters practically. Because ego death as a goal, if you're genuinely pursuing the obliteration of self, you become non-functional. You can't make decisions. You can't maintain relationships. You can't hold down a life. There are monasteries built for people pursuing that path, and even most of them don't advocate for full ego dissolution.
Whereas ego decentering, the Jungian model, actually makes you more effective, more present, more capable of genuine connection. Because you're not spending all your energy defending a constructed identity.
Right. The ego stops being a fortress and becomes a vehicle.
Which is a much more useful thing to have.
So let's talk about what actually triggers this process. Because it doesn't only happen on a meditation retreat or with substances. It happens, and this is what I find most interesting, in ordinary life, all the time.
Crisis, loss, failure. The moment when the story you've been telling about yourself stops working.
You lose a job that defined you. A relationship ends that you built your identity around. You achieve the goal you spent 10 years chasing and feel nothing, or worse, empty.
That emptiness, that's the actual ego death moment, not the mystical experience. That ordinary, devastating moment when you realize the self you've been performing isn't actually you.
And most people in that moment do one of two things. They either frantically rebuild, new job, new relationship, new goal, same structure, different furniture, or they stay in the dissolution too long and it becomes depression.
The third option, the one philosophy actually prepares you for, is to use the dissolution. To ask while the walls are down, what's actually here? What remains when the story stops?
So here's how you work with this, not how you manufacture an ego death experience. I want to be very clear. I'm not telling you to go force a crisis, but how you work with the natural ego dissolution moments that life already gives you. 3 moves. First, name the performance. Most of what we call identity is actually performance. The role you play at work, the version of yourself your family knows, the persona you've built on social media. None of those are you. They're adaptive constructs. Useful, mostly, but not you. So the first practice is radical honesty about which parts of your self-concept are performed versus genuine. You don't have to destroy the performance. Just know that it's one. That gap in awareness between the actor and the role, that's where the real self lives. Second, sit with the discomfort of not knowing. This is hard. When the story breaks down, the mind immediately wants to replace it. New story, same speed. What ego decentering requires is the capacity to stay in not knowing for longer than feels comfortable. Even just 5 minutes a day of sitting with, I don't know who I am right now, without rushing to answer it, is more powerful than most people realize. Third, ask what remains. When you strip away the job title, the relationship status, the opinions, the achievements, the failures, what's still there? There's awareness, there's presence, there's the capacity to observe. The ancient traditions across the board point to this. Whatever that witnessing presence is, that's closer to the actual self than any story you tell about it.
I'd add one thing to that. Be suspicious of any version of this that makes you feel superior to other people. The moment ego work becomes a status signal. I've done the work. I've faced my shadow. I've dissolved my ego. The ego has just found a more sophisticated hiding place. Guaranteed.
Jung called that the most dangerous stage of individuation. When the person mistakes the map for the territory, Mistakes having read about the shadow for having actually integrated it.
The shadow doesn't care how many books you've read about it. Here's my shadow side note for today. Everything Solen said is true. And I want to offer the thing that often gets left out of these conversations. Sometimes the ego needs to break. Not as a spiritual practice, not as a deliberate exercise, but as an emergency exit from a life that was built wrong from the start. Sometimes the crisis isn't a mistake. Sometimes it's the most intelligent thing the psyche has ever done. If you are in the middle of a breakdown right now, if the identity you built is collapsing and you don't know who you are, that might not be a problem to solve. That might be the solution. The question isn't how to stop it. The question is what you're going to build in its place.
And to build something real, not just a faster version of the same performance, you need to actually stay in the question long enough to hear an answer that's yours. Not your parents', not your culture's, not the algorithms. Yours.
Which takes longer than a weekend retreat. And it's less photogenic. And nobody gives you a certificate.
But it's the actual work. This week, find one role you're playing that you've confused for your actual self. Just one. Don't dismantle it. Just notice it. Name it. This is a performance. See what that awareness does.
And if you're in the middle of a collapse right now, stop trying to rebuild so fast. Something in you broke down for a reason. Give it a minute.
That's episode 2 of the Promethean Depths. New episodes throughout the week. Subscribe so you don't miss them.
And if you're in the middle of a collapse right now, stop trying to rebuild so fast. Something in you broke down for a reason. Give it a minute.
Until next time, think for yourself.
Question everything.